Good morning. It's Thursday morning in Houston at 10:30, and thanks for joining us on our third of our webinar series that we have embarked on here this month of April, and we'll intend to continue on into May and June, I imagine. And we're certainly glad you've taken the time to join us. For those that have been in the last two webinars, we're glad you've come back. And for those that are new, welcome, and we hope you continue to join us going forward. I'm Chuck McConnell. I'm responsible for our Carbon Management Center here at the University of Houston, the Center for Carbon Management and Energy. We're dedicated to a process here where we're exploring all of the technical, legal, business, policy, and scientific activities in carbon management across the board. We're committed to a process that embraces all fuels, all forms of energy, and whether it be fossil fuels, renewables, transformative new technologies, the entire mix of everything necessary in the marketplace to meet what the National Petroleum Council would call the dual challenge of more energy and less carbon. We actually look at it almost as a trilemma here, because not only do you need to do those two things, but we also hold very close the concept that it needs to be affordable, cost competitive in a global environment, and it needs to be affordable for citizens and people that are using the energy and will continue to use energy going forward. This is our webinar series. We have it every Thursday at 10:30, as I mentioned before. Those of you that are on obviously have registered, and we would encourage you to go to our website, see the archived videos from the previous 2 weeks, but also to see the areas of research that we're pursuing. And we hope that it can further give you enthusiasm about our Center for Carbon Management and find ways for you to participate, to be a part of our effort and the effort in the marketplace for carbon management. I want to thank Hunt & Andrews and Kurth. They have been our sponsor from the very beginning. We'll be sponsoring through the month of April for the webinar series that we are on there. A great supporter of our Center for Carbon Management and Energy. They have been part of our effort from the very beginning, all the way back to the early part of last summer. And so the support that we get from Hunt & Andrews and Kurth, we're very conscious of and certainly very appreciative of. Next week, we have another follow-on to today's discussion, and it will be a presentation about CCUS projects and actually the execution of projects and quite simply getting things done. There's probably no finer person in the marketplace with the experience and the ongoing reputation as David Greason. He was primary to the Petronova project here in the Houston area, continues to work in the CCUS marketplace, and there isn't anybody that understands the whole effort from the very beginning to getting it done all the way through startup and beyond. And so we certainly hope you can enjoy and involve next week with our presentation with David. The following week, at the end of the month, we're going to be talking about an area called really climate speak, or the whole ethical challenges that are going on right now in the area of carbon management. What do industries need to be able to express to the marketplace, to their shareholders, to their employees, to investors? What are the ramifications of what you say, and what are the ramifications of what you don't say? And so our legal team here at the University of Houston will be looking into that and exploring those topics throughout all of the areas around carbon management, climate change, and what corporations are facing, but also nations, investors, and shareholders. So please join us next week for that. You can learn more about this webinar series by joining our website. Certainly, as you know, need to register ahead of time, but again, go to that link and be able to explore some of the other things that are going on in carbon management. For the rest of this session today, and even as we begin, when we finish up into the Q&A at the end, please feel free to use the chat function that's on the Zoom. You'll be able to submit your questions. We'll hope to group them as best we can so that everyone questions and as many answers as we can provide, we'll get them out there to you. And hopefully that will be a good part of this discussion as well, not just the information that we'll transmit, but your questions and some of the issues behind those questions. So maybe before we go into the presentation that Nigel Jenvey will be providing, maybe we can spend just a few minutes talking about the road that we've traveled on CCUS. I think it's important for people maybe not as close to this to understand how this all began and where the marketplace is today. We started with an acronym called Carbon Capture and Storage, CCS. We had 7 regional partnerships across the country. This was back at the very beginning of 2000. It was DOE funded institutional research, and we explored a lot of things, including the Carbon Sequestration Atlas and the knowledge of the geology throughout our country for storage opportunities, different types of geological explorations, and got a much better understanding of the lay of the land in terms of geological opportunities. We also spent quite a bit of time in the early part looking at carbon capture through the National Carbon Capture Center. A lot of industries were putting effort into it and looking at developing more and novel approaches to carbon capture for effectiveness, for robustness, and certainly for cost as well. And through all that effort of those first 10 years, we were quite excited about the fact that we had developed not only the knowledge, but really a playbook. How do you begin looking at being able to capture CO2 and responsibly, safely, and permanently store it? So you need to be able to assess the geology in a region. You need to be specific to the site and the characterization of the site itself in terms of the specific geology and what's available there. Looking at tests and pilots and how one would go through that process, and then ultimately to full deployment. A playbook developed through the Department of Energy and industries working together through the partnerships. A lot of learning and a tremendous amount of effort that went into it from our friends at the Department of Energy and National Energy Technology Laboratory leading those regional carbon sequestration partnerships. And if you'll recall, about the end of the first decade, we were in a situation not a lot dissimilar from where we are today. The economy had come to a real turning point. And at that point, there was the Recovery Act with approximately $900 billion of stimulus money put into the economy. At that time, a record amount of dollars, really unheard of. Many people were wondering if something like that was really even required or feasible. But clearly, today, as we talk about numbers like 2 trillion and even more, the stimulus and the ability to get the economy back again was very critical to moving forward. The impact of the Recovery Act actually flowed to the Department of Energy and ultimately to the marketplace as 10 projects were identified for CCS. And reluctantly, CCUS from OMB and the administration. I can speak to that personally because I was part of that effort. And that was where the conversation really began in terms of carbon capture and storage, or is it really carbon capture, utilization, and storage? And could technologies such as enhanced oil recovery now be considered as important to implementing things? We actually had $3.6 billion of money go through the Department of Energy, through the Office of Fossil. And so what happened? What happened with those 10 projects? And everybody recalls, and I think still recalls, the Future Gen project. I think we need to have the context of what went on at that time, and also the comparison and contrast of where we are today. I have to say that of those 10 projects, there were any number of them that were difficult to achieve results. There was a tremendous success story, not too far from where we are here in Houston at the Petronova project. You're going to hear about that project next week with David Greason, but that's a classic example of a carbon capture, utilization, and storage project that was accomplished on time, on budget. And I think what we've been able to achieve that's really fundamentally different than where we were in 2009 is during the time that we were putting that money to those 10 projects, we were working with a technology and a value proposition that was not commercially demonstrated. It was not in a position to be able to provide warranties, guarantees, marketplace necessity for capital to be applied to a risk-based project, because there were still many questions about it. I think what we've been able to accomplish in the last 10 years since 2009 is taken technologies that were originally looked at as in development, pilots, et cetera. We were trying to take $3.6 billion and develop shovel-ready projects that were ready for the marketplace at a time when the technology was not yet ready for that. It is today. And I think that's a big part of where we are today and why the future perhaps may be a lot more strong. And so, as I mentioned, carbon capture and storage has now become CCUS. It's the acronym of choice for most of us. Those that use that acronym, I like to refer to those folks as the enlightened people. Those that are still looking at CCS as simply a waste disposal program probably are not in a position to really understand all of the benefits of utilization. But of course, the concepts around CCS continue to be with us, will be important, and I think blending the CCS into the CCUS program has been part of the learning that we've gone through. But we've got some headwinds, we've got some tailwinds, things that we've learned. I mentioned a few of the original headwinds that went into the program, but today we have some tailwinds in terms of where's the energy market going, how are we poised. Up until not long ago, the 45Q tax credits and the National Petroleum Council study had been released. A lot of optimism about CCUS as a program that was not only important, but fundamentally necessary to be able to achieve climate goals, to be able to achieve an accretive business proposition in the marketplace that can bring both environmental responsibility as well as the importance of being accretive to business. And so now, what's the current global upheaval going to do to CCUS? Do we have the kind of competitive alternatives out there in the marketplace today with the other renewable options that are there? And certainly we all understand that depending on where the geography is, where the specifics of the challenge is, that's why you do need all of the above. CCUS doesn't work everywhere. Wind doesn't work everywhere, and solar doesn't work everywhere either. And so that's the challenge as we bring together all of those options, is where can we most effectively deploy these technologies that are so important to the future. We need to advance the technology, not just for the United States and for the challenge that we see in front of us, but probably more importantly now, as we've evolved CCUS for fossil fuels, and the technology and the know-how necessary for the developing world. The world where many people live in energy poverty, the growth anticipation continues to be there over time because many of these people don't even have energy today, and they will need it going forward. So how do we provide responsible and environmentally advanced technologies to be able to provide that necessary energy? And we're going to talk a little bit today about why CCUS is something you cannot ignore. The IEA has made forecasts going forward. And again, it requires an all of the above solution basket in which CCUS plays a significant and major part. And so I'd like to turn the presentation over to a good colleague, friend, and probably one of the most well-known people in the marketplace, Nigel Jenvey. Nigel and I go back a ways in terms of CCS, CCUS, the lessons learned, and as Nigel moves the ball forward at Gaffney Cline as the global head of carbon management, has some perspectives to provide to you in terms of CCUS, where things are going. And again, as we're into this presentation, please use your chat function to ask questions along the way, and we'll do our best to address those at the conclusion of the presentation. So with that, let me turn it over to Nigel Jenvey.
Thank you, Chuck, for the opportunity to speak today to everybody. And thanks also to others at Energy, including Lauren Kibler and Ramanan Krishnamurthy. Best wishes to everybody that's tuning in during this health and economic crisis. As Chuck said, my name is Nigel Jenvey, and I'm Global Head of Carbon Management at Gaffney Cline, located here in Houston, Texas. However, Gaffney Cline is an international petroleum consultancy and has been operating worldwide for over 50 years. We at Gaffney Cline focus solely on the petroleum and energy industry and specialize in the provision of policy, strategy, technical and commercial assistance, both to governments, financial institutions, and national and international oil, gas, and energy companies worldwide. The focus of the talk today is going to be around sustaining investment in carbon capture, use, and storage. And Gaffney Cline has considerable experience with CCUS projects worldwide and also technology market assessments, including assignments for some of the industry's key players. So I'll start off, unfortunately, with providing you a disclaimer statement. Now, this first slide provides a summary of the entire presentation. And progress in carbon capture, use, and storage needs to be sustained through market declines. And why is that? To underpin continued investment in oil and gas through the energy transition. Now, oil and gas companies, like other energy companies, face a range of financial, social, and political pressures that will likely intensify. Those financial pressures include the risk associated with continued investment in fossil fuels, level of debt, investment return, and commodity price changes. The social pressures include local environmental impacts, social license to operate, leave it in the ground, divestment movements away from fossil fuels. The political pressures include the Paris Agreement and the myriad of other energy-related policies and regulations. Now, there are a range of carbon solutions available to address greenhouse gas emissions from oil and gas, and CCUS is available to reduce Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Now, that's the emissions associated with the supply of oil and gas to consumers, and as of today, that relates to about 15% of global energy greenhouse gas emissions. However, that can vary significantly from field to field, region to region. And we were involved in a groundbreaking science paper in 2018, which looked at the global carbon intensity of crude oil supply. But CCUS is also a technology that's critical to address Scope 3 emissions for oil and gas companies. Now, Scope 3 emissions are those associated with the end use of oil and gas, typically 85% of the total life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. they're not in control of that end use. And that indeed is the challenge in achieving net zero. Now, all credible future energy scenarios recognize that fossil fuels will remain part of the total global energy mix for the next several decades. And CCUS is essential to addressing the dual challenge of providing affordable, reliable energy to meet the world's growing demand while addressing the risk of climate change, and therefore tackles the concerns that society and investors have. The US is already a leader and has over 80% of the world's installed CCUS capacity and has benefited from consistent congressional support for well over 2 decades. This has enabled the Department of Energy to lead and support public-private collaboration on science and technology, the Environmental Protection Agency to establish a comprehensive regulatory framework, and the Internal Revenue Service to establish world-leading policy support with the 45Q tax credit. The US is therefore the world leader, uniquely positioned to deploy the technologies at scale. And government stimulus programs now are key inflection points in determining the future of energy. We saw since 2010, really about $3 trillion globally have been put into low carbon energy, with implicit carbon pricing in the region of hundreds, if not thousands of dollars per ton. Now, this is definitely a time where leaders and successes are defined. Innovation and stakeholder communication is just as critical as capital discipline and operating cash flow. Now, if we look back, oil and gas investment was getting back towards its 2014 peak. And that was about $720 billion during the $100 per barrel oil price period. And really prior to the price drop in 2015 down to $40 a barrel. We've seen a gradual rise post-2016 to about $480 billion in 2018 and about $500 billion in 2019. This was commensurate with low levels of new conventional oil and gas projects alongside a collapse in exploration spending. Now, capital discipline and careful project selection really were the watchwords of the industry historically. But some other increases in larger, more complex projects were happening in 2019. Of course, with the decline in oil price, 2020 to 2021 will see about a 20 to 30% decline, providing a temporary collapse in demand to about $350 to $400 billion worth of capital spend. Now, sanctioned projects, of course, will continue, but really what this means is there will be likely few new FIDs. And I do remember when I first joined the industry, manager at the time said to me, as soon as you see oil below $30 a barrel, go hug a well. So what will happen post-coronavirus recovery? Will companies go beyond disposing of mature non-core assets or more difficult assets with unfavorable fiscal terms? And will they now also start to include carbon and climate risks to be part of their decision-making processes? Now, oil and gas has been facing financial, social, and political pressures for some time, but they will likely intensify as shareholders and investors now review their portfolio risks. The social license for oil and gas is at the same time moving from local to more global impacts. Now, conventionally, social acceptance of oil and gas projects was needed in order to build and operate facilities. Now it's also a global impact issue, and it's a factor in society's use of the products, certainly in developing countries, but also their willingness to invest because alternatives have emerged to supply energy, and global environmental impacts are being highlighted, and that really impacts where society puts its money and therefore the finance before it's really going to impact end demand. Now, voting for shareholder resolutions on climate have doubled since 2015, and we've seen climate-related shareholder resolutions that seek to improve disclosure and align strategies in sustainable pathways. They've increased also along with investor collaborations seeking to facilitate engagement. Now, investors also, through buying and selling of shares and the supply of finance to companies, have increased their required rates of return on equity for the industry. And you'll see that in the chart on the right-hand side, which shows since 2010 through to 2018, the rising cost of equity versus a relatively stable cost of debt. And an increasingly number of banks, pension funds, insurance companies, institutional and private investors, they're limiting their exposure to certain types of fossil fuels, mainly coal, but now restrictions are increasingly seen on some types of oil and gas projects as well. For the last few years, more capital has been spent on electricity than oil and gas supply. And the increasing debt to equity ratios of now over $1 trillion in the oil and gas supply industry, of course, is likely going to be a focus over the next couple of years. However, continued investment in oil and gas is needed through the energy transition, and that's both for existing and new fields to offset natural decline. So investment in upstream projects is still needed in climate and energy system models. As I've shown here on the right, this is the sustainable development scenario from the International Energy Agency. And that's really because existing fields, if we didn't invest on them, they'd decline at about 8% per year. And that is larger than really any plausible fall in global demand, about 2.5%. In the IEA SDS, now that's akin to a 2-degree type scenario. And of course, barring any disruptions, the like that we've seen, albeit temporary, like coronavirus. Now, no other sources are available at the scales needed in this time frame. Energy transitions take 40 to 50 years and usually result in the addition rather than the subtraction of energy sources. There is therefore robust growth in oil and gas consumption, and continued investment in oil and gas is needed to prevent a mismatch. In the IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario, around $500 billion of investment, similar to 2019, is spent in the next decade, out to 2030. And in the decade after, 2030 to 2040, around $400 billion worth of investment. Now, that said, however, the type of oil and gas resources and how they are developed, how they're produced, that will have to change substantially. And generally, a higher percentage of spend over time will go to existing fields rather than new developments. A consequence of reduced demand and investment and more competitive markets may mean that those with low-cost resources, tight capital control, top quartile environmental performance, and economic diversification in their economies will likely prevail. Actions to increase market share, like we've seen recently by the large producers, will bring down oil prices to what we have seen recently, and companies and countries will therefore have to find ways to maintain a fiscal balance during such oil price wars of attrition. Now, responsible oil and gas supply in the context of greenhouse gas emissions includes carbon management, and that comprises CCUS deployment for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Now, while there is some uncertainty in the future of oil and gas demand and supply, there is certainty in needing to minimize emissions directly from oil and gas operations and indirectly from the energy that the industry uses. This will re-establish societal acceptance and also build investor confidence. There are many cost-effective solutions to reduce emissions, and this can be seen in the plot on the right-hand side from the IEA, showing the changes in the global emissions intensity of oil between 2018 and 2030, and the different solutions that can affect that. Now, from a marginal cost perspective, they start with energy efficiency, then tackling methane emissions, integrating renewables and low carbon electricity, and minimizing flaring of associated gas. Now for CCUS, it makes sense to consider looking at venting of CO2 associated with gas processing and the use of CCUS in purer streams within refining. However, reducing methane leaks to the atmosphere is probably the single most important and cost-effective way for the industry to bring down the emissions from its Scope 1 and Scope 2. Now, CCUS is capital intensive, and in the absence of revenues from utilization and a market for the lower carbon products, it relies on public policy to address the externality. So CCUS can stabilize the oil and gas market through the energy transition. Now, how's this? It creates more headroom in carbon budgets for oil and gas, and a pathway for net zero through negative emissions technologies. Now, the strategic value of large-scale deployment of CCUS to the oil and gas industry has not been widely communicated and understood. We evaluated data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, Fifth Assessment Report, AR5, to assess the potential impact of CCUS on oil and gas demand. You'll see that there on the right-hand side, the graph of both oil and natural gas. The impact of CCUS, you can see, is determined by comparing energy use from oil and gas between scenarios that deploy CCUS and those that had no CCUS deployment, whilst also meeting the global average temperature limits that mitigate the worst impact of climate change. Now, we found that the impact of CCS on oil was an additional 2 billion barrels of oil that would be sustained through CCS deployment through 2050, and for gas, 1,300 TCF of gas. Now, they're significant additions in comparison to what has been cumulatively produced today. CCUS can therefore underpin the growth of gas and also defer the decline of oil demand. CCUS enables society to continue using oil and gas at a scale as an affordable and reliable energy source, while also ensuring CO2 concentrations are limited to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. There are also other additional sources to strategic value for CCUS implementation, including continued resource development, use of existing infrastructure, creation of jobs, and growth of gross domestic product. The resources and skills of the oil and gas industry played, therefore, a central role in CCUS development and deployment. Scaling up CCUS, improving performance and reducing costs relies on large-scale engineering and project management capabilities, along with the technical qualities that are key attributes of oil and gas companies and their staff. 3/4 of the CO2 capture today in large-scale facilities is from oil and gas operations, and the industry accounts for more than 1/3 of overall spending on CCUS projects, as you can see on the chart on the right-hand side of this slide. Now, CCUS also provides new business model opportunities for the oil and gas industry to partner with other industries that don't have their skills and capabilities, but also to repurpose their assets, both pipeline facilities and also subsurface, while also allowing them to reduce emissions, much of which is associated with the end use of their own products, i.e. Scope 3 emissions, or materials and energy use in their own Scope 2 emissions. Now, the National Petroleum Council study recommended some key enablers that will secure continued deployment of CCUS in the United States, clarifying the level of value of the incentives and revenues needed to commercially move from 25 million tonnes today out to 500 million tonnes per annum of CCUS capacity over the next 25 years. In 2018 and 2019, I had the honour and pleasure to serve as the alternate chair to the CCUS study coordinating subcommittee of the NPC. Now, that study was undertaken at the request of the US Secretary of Energy and reported out in December 2019. The study had over 300 participants from more than 110 different organizations, representing not just the oil and gas industry, but other industries consulting financial companies, academia, NGOs, and also government. Now, a differential feature of the study has been to assess the cost to capture, transport, and store CO2 from the largest US stationary sources, reducing emissions from almost 2 gigatons of CO2 per annum to 1,000 million tons, from a range of different industries and power sources that underpin today's society. This allowed identification of the level of value necessary to enable deployment, builds the case for ongoing RD&D across the entire CCUS value chain, and enables assessment of the economic benefits. Full deployment would be equivalent to a 10-fold increase in the CO2 reductions achieved from all wind turbines currently installed in the United States. Now, the report is available from the NPC website, www.npc.org, or a dedicated website, www.dualchallenge.npc.org. Now, while of course I cannot cover the specifics of the report in the time available today, there have been a number of dedicated webinars over the last few months, and more are planned. Today, I can give you the highlights from a roadmap that we developed to help communicate the enablers for deployment at scale that were derived from the production of this cost curve that you can see on the right-hand side. You can see that the 500 million tons per annum across the x-axis of the stationary point source emissions we identified that could be achievable over the next 25 years really was broken down into 3 phases: an activation phase, an expansion phase, and an at-scale deployment phase. So the NPC study found that CCUS creates jobs, secures existing infrastructure, and provides energy security, whilst also providing value to society as the most cost-effective way to achieve deep decarbonisation. The NPC roadmap you can see on the right-hand side has the activation phase, the expansion phase, and the at-scale deployment phase, and we break this down per phase to what this actually means in terms of volume, in terms of the total investment required, what would be required in pipeline infrastructure, how many annual jobs would be created, a volumetric impact, and how long each phase would actually take to achieve. Now, the activation phase was really around clarifying existing tax policy and regulations that would activate really a doubling of today's US capacity, moving from 25 million tons a day to about 60 million tons per day of CCUS capacity within the next 5 to 7 years. The expansion phase was really around extending and expanding current policies and developing a durable legal and regulatory framework that would enable the next phase of CCUS projects, achieving an additional 75 to 85 million tons per annum, up to 150 million tons per annum cumulative CCUS capacity, really over the next 15 years. And then finally, the at-scale deployment phase really was around achieving CCUS deployment at scale, adding in the additional 350 to 400 million tons per annum of CCUS capacity over the next 25 years. And that would really require substantially increased support driven by national policies. To underpin all of this, the DOE investment in RD&D of about $15 billion over the next 10 years is critical to accelerate cost and performance improvements. The volume that phases would achieve, ultimately by the time we get to at-scale deployment, would volumetrically be equivalent to about 13 million barrels per day of capacity. Similar scale to what the crude oil system is today domestically. It would require an incremental investment of about $680 billion US and would provide support for 236,000 additional US jobs and a GDP of $21 billion annually. Now, once this is achieved, the potential, of course, exists for US technology and capability exports to other countries that are also trying to achieve deep decarbonisation pathways. Now, as we saw in the NPC study, tax credits are critical to CCUS activation and expansion phases. However, they are now at risk during a period of economic recovery due to lower corporate profits and weaker tax equity markets. Now, 45Q is a fuel and technology neutral production tax credit for CCUS deployment. There are some other tax credits that were discussed and also had some recommendations within the NPC study, including 48A and B, but that at the moment is a fuel and technology specific investment tax credit. And then 43C is an oil price indexed enhanced oil recovery tax credit. Now, to achieve CCUS deployment, the US government is going to need to ensure that the tax credit can be monetized through the economic downturn, and also consider establishing changes to these other tax credits to ensure adequate additional incentives are available. The Section 1603 program back in 2009 was created as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Tax Act to increase investment in domestic clean energy production. Now, the Department of Treasury made these payments in lieu of investment tax credits that were available at the time to eligible applicants, and the purpose was to reimburse them for a portion of the costs of their projects. Now, specified energy property included solar, wind, geothermal, biomass, fuel cells, hydropower, combined heat and power, landfill gas, municipal solid waste, and microturbine property, everything apart from carbon capture, use and storage. Now, that was because CCUS really at that time in 2009 was not ready for deployment. And therefore, a more appropriate mechanism, a DOE grant program, also part of ARA, really focused on demonstration. However, now we have CCUS deployment is ready for activation, and the 45Q production tax credit is the main funding mechanism. Now, the 1603 program in 2009 was very successful. It really underpinned deployment of wind and solar at scale and dispersed over $26 billion to help fund about 100,000 different clean energy projects across the United States. And individual awards even reached about $500 million. So another way to ensure continued investment in CCUS is to include CCUS in green finance, which will enable oil and gas companies to continue investing in CCUS through accessing non-traditional sources of capital. Now, to ensure the sustainability of oil and gas in the energy transition, carbon management must be deployed massively to cut greenhouse gas emissions from its operations and end product use. To achieve this means substantial sums of capital in the hundreds of billions of dollars, as we've seen from the NPC study, that needs to be deployed in addition to the capital required to satisfy the world's growing demand for oil and gas. Financial markets play a critical role in developing the energy transition. An additional source of financing is the ever-growing area of green finance. Now, organizations with investments of $85 trillion have signed up to the UN Principles for Responsible Investments. They've allocated now greater proportions of their capital to investments that are regarded as green, sustainable, and that in effect deliver the energy transition. This green capital pool now amounts to more than $31 trillion and has grown by over 200% in the last 5 years. The most popular financial instrument lies in green bonds. In 2019, it totaled itself $255 billion. About $80 billion, 31%, of green bonds were issued to energy-related projects, and about $60 billion in green bonds were issued to non-financial corporations in 2019. As examples of who are doing the lending, the 6 largest multilateral development banks financed about $43 billion in 2018 for projects that address climate change. Green finance accounted for about 40% of the investments made by the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Citi has an environmental finance goal of $100 billion over 10 years for projects to reduce the impacts of climate change. So the list of actually who is providing this financing from a financial corporation standpoint goes on and on. While the majority of these green bonds, though, have been issued or used by utility companies, great example is O&G in France, for renewable power projects, there are some examples of this financial instrument being used by oil and gas companies, including about $700 million of green bonds being used by Repsol and Jiangsu Senghong in China for downstream facility energy efficiency improvements, along with more recently the Shell's $10 billion revolving credit facility, where rather than a green bond, the rate is really based upon corporate greenhouse gas reduction performance. So carbon management projects in oil and gas, including energy efficiency, flaring reduction, methane emissions, integration of renewables, and CCUS can qualify for green finance because they result in a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The issuers publicly state capital is earmarked to those funds, and they structure those funds around the voluntary green bond principles. Now, of course, that attracts investment from new funds with ESG mandates, creates more demand, lowers financing costs, making the investments potentially also eligible for tax incentives. Yields have shown to be comparable, if not better, than normal investment grade yields, and popularity is expected to continue through the oil and gas market turbulence. So this provides developers access to new capital markets that can be blended with traditional sources of debt and equity to achieve the best financing possible for CCUS projects. The rapid growth of green financing means it's no longer a niche activity. Coupled with ESG credit ratings and investor audits, green finance is taking over financial markets. We've provided at Gaffney Cline a second opinion piece, which is part of the green bond principles, to help secure a green bond for use in the financing of a major gas flaring reduction project, as a good example. So lastly, I wanted to leave you with a summary of Gaffney Cline's offer in carbon management. Now, we help our clients de-risk continued investment in oil and gas through the energy transition. As the diagram shows, we believe that the third missing cog in the wheel between investment in oil and gas has been carbon management. The carbon management practice at Gaffney Cline builds on our oil and gas expertise in performing technical, commercial, and strategic assessments, provides trusted third-party due diligence to our clients in their evaluations, reporting requirements, permit applications, and financial transactions. Now, our practice is divided into 4 pillars of activity that can be combined into a systematic approach to understand and solve issues related to oil and gas resources, assets, and investments. The first one is quantification of carbon intensity. That's the amount of CO2 equivalent emissions per unit of product, for analysis, evaluation using the tool, and benchmarking against an existing database we have of 9,000 fields across 90 countries. Secondly, it's evaluation of carbon and climate policies and regulations across the value chain, from reservoir to operation to point of sale, and how they may influence business competitiveness over time. Thirdly, assessment of carbon solutions that are available to avoid, reduce, replace, offset, or sequester, in terms of CCUS, CO2 emissions in a cost-effective and time-based manner to ensure continued compliance and competitiveness. And lastly, 4, verification and accreditation of emissions reductions to provide an independent view for stakeholders and enable realization of associated benefits, either in compliance or voluntary markets. These insights, really coupled with GCA expert analysis, enable our clients, such as E&P companies, midstream, downstream, utilities, equity investors, sovereign asset owners and regulators to make informed decisions on project acquisitions, developments, and investments. So that's the end of the presentation today. Thank you for your time, and I'm now ready to take any questions you may have.
Well, thanks, Nigel. Again, we'll encourage you to continue to use the chat function on the presentation. But I think we've received a number of great questions, Nigel, and maybe I try my best to group them in as best we can and get some of your reactions to it. I guess first and foremost, start out with the concept of, okay, is it relevant? Is it impactful? CCUS. How much of the global challenge of CO2 emissions will come from CCUS in comparison to a lot of the other parts of the portfolio necessary to achieve the total result that we want? I seem to remember something around 10% of that total challenge CCUS bites into. Is that about right?
Yeah, Chuck, that is right. Within predictions, of course, and those, forecasts and scenarios for low carbon energy technologies, they all depend upon the relative cost and performance of those different technologies versus the reductions that are being targeted. And so within, of course, those predictions and forecasts, yes, always it's been from the IEA and various other groups, around 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions reductions will come from CCUS. But, of course, it depends. And it depends upon how much we can push down that cost and push up the performance of CCUS projects. That really will, of course, make and control the forecast of how much it will deliver to greenhouse gas emissions reductions. It has potential to do a lot more, and it just depends upon cost and performance.
Well, that kind of gets to the next question, really, Nigel, and that is that you've used the term cost effective a number of times in our discussion here, and there's two parts to this question. First of all is that cost effectiveness compared to the current state now in what we have available to us, and the fact that the IPC has actually looked at forecasts in a world with or without CCUS, and you might want to comment on the dramatic difference in those two scenarios, and then maybe specifically speak to the concept of the NPC study not relying on magical new technology, but that in fact the study really bases itself on existing technology, a hope and an expectation, but not part of the forecast that some magical technology is going to save the day and make it usable. In fact, it only would provide upside.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. So yes, cost effectiveness, of course, about achieving a certain target versus those other options. And of course, every energy technology really has a place in the market, but that really changes. It changes regionally, of course, and it changed depending upon the supply and demand profiles of that region. And really what that energy really is being used for, from, of course, domestic use through to industrial use, et cetera, and the resources that region has. And natural resources, of course, include wind and solar, and of course, the other traditional natural resources, fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. So definitely cost effectiveness really is a regionalized question. Definitely from looking at ranges and different approaches that different countries are having. Of course, cost effectiveness is also dependent upon how much penetration things like intermittent renewables can have versus the introduction of energy storage capacity and the cost of that versus indeed, you know, other traditional forms of energy which can, of course, supply instantaneous, near instantaneous energy to cope with fluctuating demand. So yeah, it really depends, and of course that effectiveness of CCUS also ensures continued use of existing infrastructure and all of the capital that's been put into the world energy system today, the way the products are used throughout society as well. So CCUS enables cost effectively to underpin a lot of that. And the other cost effective aspect, of course, is that there's certain emissions which are really, really hard to actually abate, particularly in transportation, particularly, of course, in aviation. And CCUS enables us to also tackle those through negative emissions technologies. Of course, that includes bioenergy with CCS and also direct air capture. So yeah, cost effective it is in order to achieve reductions in emissions. Now, existing technology, the way we looked at that with the NPC study indeed is what can we activate today? So therefore, what is the technology that's available today that's proven, that's available with commercial guarantees and can be deployed at scale? And of course, that is post-combustion amine-based capture, that is CO2 transportation through pipelines, and also use in enhanced oil recovery at scale and permanent storage also in saline formations. So important to have that benchmark today to really demonstrate to people that CCUS is not just some future mystical technology that could be achievable out into the future, but it actually can be done at scale today. Now, of course, with innovation and continued investment in R&D, there's potential to introduce different types of technologies throughout the whole CCUS supply chain to improve cost and performance. And indeed, we took a look at that, took at various views of previous studies that have been done. And conventionally, most people are looking at about 10% in the nearer term, really through application of learning by doing, and then moving through to about 30–40% cost reduction over time with the introduction of some of these breakthrough technologies.
Yeah, and I guess point of clarification, we've had some questions come in on this. This target that we're looking for is not to necessarily eliminate all emissions, period. The target is to eliminate the necessary emissions so that we can achieve a 2-degree world that we're anticipating going forward. So it's not a cure-all by any means, but it is the impactful part of taking the bite out of those emissions that are so important. And I think it's a good point to clarify here.
Yeah.
Maybe let's pull a string a little bit more, Nigel, on oil and gas capital budgets. I don't think anybody that's on this webinar is not aware of what a big strain now all of the majors have, and those are the international oil companies. Maybe a comment or two on that, not to get into any specifics on any of the individual companies, but perhaps a comparison and contrast versus national oil companies around the world, where perhaps the shareholder impact is and definition of success is quite a bit different in those national oil companies, are they not?
Definitely, where companies get their capital from equity and debt changes and varies, and of course how they act in their economies change, of course, between independent international companies and also national oil and gas companies. But I would say that the perspectives around the social license are uniform across all of those different companies. It's perhaps more predominant in national oil companies, of course, because they are more impacted by policy, which is, of course, driven by societal viewpoints. So, and the financial then, pressures that are on or the more international oil and gas companies, yes, that's exerted more from indeed, yes, policy, but also then the shareholders and where they're getting their capital. So actually, how it manifests itself between IOCs and NOCs is relatively the same.
Interesting. Do you see any places in the world besides the United States that might be more likely to be first movers in this area in terms of being able to take advantage of CO2 that's being utilized, specifically enhanced oil recovery? The thoughts about the geologies, the fields, the conditions that they're in, where might you look at favorably around the world?
Yeah, so I think the other bright spots around the world for CCUS at the moment, particularly Europe, my home country, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, have had significant efforts over a long time, continuing with governmental support. It was great to see the UK government coming out with, I think, £800 million worth of support for some of the CCUS projects there just recently. Netherlands as well, some great projects and clusters and hubs being developed, of course, in the port of Rotterdam and their roundabouts. Of course, up in Norway, where a lot of CCUS deployment in oil and gas, originally started with not using enhanced oil recovery, but of course, really pushing forward the use of saline formations. It's great to see the Northern Lights project there and really develop the business case for oil and gas companies to develop a storage site and then really aggregate different CO2 sources around the area and the region to then really develop that resource, that storage site even further. Of course, the incremental cost of adding in storage capacity is cents on the ton. So it's great work going on in Europe. The other places, China, a number of projects coming through in China right now. And of course, that's really important for global GHG emissions, particularly, of course, with the amount of coal-fired power that they put in place over the last decade in China to get an off-take and to get a commercial use for some of that CO2. Fantastic to see that. The other major bright spot, I would say, though, is going to be the Middle East. There's so many projects that are being assessed right now there, whether it's from CO2 emissions from oil and gas refineries, from the power plants. The list goes on and on. So it's great works going on there. So there's so much engagement. It's really heartening to see all of these different new projects starting up globally.
Very often in this industry, we tend to, and I think it's from the roots of where we all began with coal-fired power plants in this country and looking at emissions from coal-fired power plants and a way to keep that market moving forward. I think the evolution to oil and gas, obviously a big part of it, and now ultimately natural gas-fired power plants as well, being essential to the ability to deliver 100% carbon-free on-stream power 24/7. I mean, it's a unique value proposition that's not available in the marketplace otherwise. But speak a little bit about the petrochemical industry, the cement industries, the other industries that are out there, Nigel. It may not be specific to the Gaffney Cline practice, but I'm sure you see those sources also as being able to play in this market.
Definitely those sources, of course, produce really, useful, usable by society, materials, plastics and chemicals, and of course, building materials. And of course, they're looking at, of course, sustainability. And most of those emissions, or some of those emissions at least, are process-based emissions. So they're not just combustion emissions, which are lower purity. So they have some higher purity sources within those industries that they can look at. And of course, the higher the purity and also partial pressures of CO2 stream, the lower cost of capture will be. But they also, I think, are importantly, and why I brought up the fact that they produce materials that society buys, is that those materials can then be labeled with a low carbon product, green label. So that's really, of course, important to then find and develop those markets around those low carbon materials and products, and really establish that societal demand for those innovative ways of incorporating CCUS into the process emissions from those different industries, and then producing a green labeled product at the end, which then, of course, will increase demand, may even secure long-term contracts, and may even achieve a premium in the marketplace.
So as you look at a crude oil that's being produced using CCUS and enhanced oil recovery, speak a little bit about that life cycle analysis that ultimately could be realistically looked at as a green barrel of oil, or certainly a greener barrel of oil, and certainly not a barrel that would not have been produced otherwise. It's a global market with a global demand. So the question is, where does the next barrel come from? So a barrel coming from CCUS with EOR, in your view, where does that stack up in terms of a life cycle?
Yeah, so it all depends, of course, of where the boundary of that life cycle emission analysis is drawn, and what the comparison is against, and what's been displaced in the marketplace. There's been some great work and some great papers that have been put into this, really worldwide, including from the International Energy Agency. And so I would definitely recommend people take a look at some of those analyses. It is a complicated question, Chuck, that hasn't really necessarily got a simple answer. Certainly a green barrel of oil, is achievable if the CO2 source originally, of course, comes from a negative emissions technology like BECCS and or direct air capture. Of course, you then move into perhaps a different classification if the CO2 is coming from another man-made emission source, like from one of the process emissions from industry and or power plants. And then perhaps it's, comparatively speaking to another barrel of oil that's produced, yes, it can be definitely low carbon. So perhaps we classify that as a blue barrel of oil or something. So definitely there's a whole spectrum of different carbon intensities out there for different oil types. And of course, we can't double dip for the emissions, where the emissions are being actually captured from, if it comes from industry or power. And so, yeah, it's a great question. And there are some protocols and some best practices out there in order to get the numbers right. So of course, companies can really look to put that into the marketplace with confidence.
So as we're looking these days at oil prices and the pressure in the marketplace, and certainly those of us living here in Texas see West Texas and the impact there. A lot of enhanced oil recovery going on today. How do you view CCUS in a place like the Permian as an example, where existing pipes, existing geology, existing infrastructure is in place? Will it continue to be a competitive way of getting the next barrel out of the Permian?
Yeah, so the economics of CO2 EOR, versus unconventionals, are very, very interesting. If you look at how capital spend is deployed, what the return on investment and break even is, how well they produce cash flow over time. Ultimately, you know, they have very similar rates of return, but they have completely different, you know, capital spend and operating cost profiles. And for any, you know, operator, you know, one provides a real good hedge versus another type, such as unconventional portfolios. So, so when oil and gas companies look at their portfolio decisions, I think definitely CO2 EOR, you know, should be one of those things, and looking properly at its profile of economics versus others, and how well they can really use their capital, and of course how well they can really, you know, prove to investors that they are on a pathway towards sustainability as well. And of course, you know, CO2 EOR gives that potential as well for them to do that as part of conventional practice in oil and gas. So definitely it should be part of their decision-making process. There's a lot of CO2 EOR barrels that still are yet to be developed. So, so yeah, the opportunity's there, and now is the time when oil and gas companies should really consider that appropriately.
You spoke a bit about green financing and how important that could be to the future. I don't know that many of us are that familiar with the mechanisms of attracting that kind of a financial flow. Maybe you can reflect a little bit on, just as a developer that might be listening in today, what mechanisms might one move forward with?
Yeah, so so we did a project that I'll use as an example for a major development bank, international development bank, looking at you know, investing in a gas flaring reduction project, a major large-scale project, and really, you know, fundamentally it comes down to, you know, being able to do an assessment, life cycle type assessment, looking at displacement of products that are associated with the use of the project and the products that the carbon capture system is put on, versus the marketplace that exists today. So we did that at basically at the end, that analysis, and came out with a second opinion piece now that's been used successfully to really prove that yes, there is a net greenhouse gas reduction benefit of installing a flaring reduction project in the petrochemicals plant and using gas in power, because of course that displaces other higher carbon intensity fuels, whether it be in power, whether it be in cooking, and so there is a net benefit to of course the global atmosphere, and benefit to reduce emissions for climate change. So they're the protocols, they're in place. There's not many second opinion providers for oil and gas projects out there. Really, we're the only dedicated one that actually does this. And so yeah, if there are project developers that are interested, please, you know, come speak to us, and we can you know, demystify what is required in order to do it. It's actually quite quick. It only took us about a week and a half to do that project before.
And what about the markets that are out there? Do you find that producing a greener barrel, or as you described it, maybe a blue barrel of oil, a plastic that comes from a facility that is actually working at a net zero type of circumstance due to CCUS and perhaps renewable power that they're purchasing or whatever, how could an organization put a bubble around their production facilities and make a claim that they're producing something from a net zero type facility? Is that realizable in the marketplace yet?
Definitely plausible. So, I'm glad we've got a methane management practice. So this is a concrete example. So, so Jennifer Stewart runs our methane work, and she works basically as an executive in Southwestern Energy. Southwestern Energy went through their portfolio basically reduced methane emissions from their gas production and also water use, and then got a certification process put in place to then be able to sell that as a certified responsible gas, lower methane emissions and lower water use into the northeast of the United States, and found some buyers for that premium product. Now, premium products are going for different environmental attributes that they're happening, all around the marketplace worldwide for different things. In LNG cargoes, it's going on over in Asia right now, especially into to Singapore and into Japan. Decarbonizing effectively some of the end use of that LNG, not just with scope 1 and scope 2 emissions associated with it, but also the scope 3 emissions by buying offsets. And so we also have an Marissa Hamsick in our team in Gaffney Cline. She's our carbon offsets and carbon markets expert, and she's able to then also provide some advice and some consulting around that. So yes, those products are happening today in various different markets, and it's starting to happen in energy too.
Yeah, a lot of nascent development work, obviously, in the business area. Nigel, just maybe to wrap things up here today, think a little bit about, and maybe you can offer some of your closing thoughts around CCUS. I would offer that in November, about the time when the NPC study was wrapped up, we had some of those review discussions, and then, of course, anticipating the release of it in January, a completely different economic view of the world at that point. Here we are today. What do you see as maybe the overarching headwinds and tailwinds that were going on at this point in time? And what kind of signposts might we look for in the marketplace for encouragement and enthusiasm?
Thanks. Yeah, Chuck. So, if we look back and if we look at some of the great annual reports that the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute puts out annually, they been tracking CCUS deployment for a number of years. And if we look back to the previous recession, and see then really the aftermath of really what happened globally with CCUS, of course there was a significant impact. And we were just, as you said, starting to see the light really in 2017, 18 and 19 with more projects starting up. So it really did take a good 5 years really for existing projects, unfortunately, to then, really struggle to actually implement from the last recession. And then for us to move back up the wave of new projects to where, of course, all of this capacity was now being planned to come in 2020s, the early 2020s. Now, of course, that's some of the headwind if we look back, but the tailwind that we've got right now is we still executed demonstration projects. We've still proven that these technologies can be deployed today. And so the signpost that we have to do now is, of course, just like wind and solar did back in the previous recession, is really underpin successful deployment. Now, and those two keys for underpinning deployment right now are going to be government stimulus programs and also accessing the green finance capital pool. They're the two fundamental things that will keep CCUS moving along and implemented in the next 5 really to 10 years. Otherwise, we will likely, I'm afraid, see another reduction in total projects. And of course, for the wider energy and also the world in terms of reducing emissions, that is going to be a problem. So the world needs to realize the value that CCUS brings and really support it now, because it was at the brink of effectively deployment at scale. So let's get behind it. Let's get everybody, speak to people. It's not just a fossil fuel technology for the people that don't want fossil fuels in the mix. It secures net zero emissions through negative emissions technologies. And it provides, indeed, you were mentioning the trilemma, you know, of affordable energy. It allows the world to continue to use existing infrastructure around energy in the industrial landscape. And that's really, really important now for people's jobs, to make sure that we really use the dollars that are in the system effectively today.
Yeah, it is kind of an interesting way of looking at it, Nigel. I mean, you can look at it from both sides of the same coin, if you will. On one side, you have today's developed world with a lot of infrastructure, actually a lot of capital and assets to sweat. They're there, they need to be utilized and continue to provide those cost-effective means of supplying energy, and to do it environmentally responsibly. The other side of that same coin really kind of works itself into, okay, we've got places in the world that do need more energy, will need more energy. They will have available fuels and technologies that, again, there is no silver bullet for meeting the energy challenge going around the world. I mean, certainly there'll be renewables, certainly there'll be other forms of energy storage and transformative technologies, but there will certainly be coal and oil and gas that will continue to be used around the world. And that's a reality. And I think given where we are with this technology, and I think much of the leadership that the world looks for the United States to provide certainly will come from this. I can't thank you enough for your thoughts today, being with us today, and thank all of you that have been on this webcast for the entirety of it. We'll be providing again next week, the next in our series. Again, want to thank Hunt & Andrews and Kurth for their sponsorship of this month's activities. And next week, one of the projects that's on everyone's mind, actually, and we actually had a few questions that we were not able to get to today, is the Petronova project. Well, there's nobody knows it better than David Greason. He built it, he started it up, and it's operating. And, you know, does it work? Yes, it does. Is it commercially available? It sure is. Are there economic challenges going forward to a coal-fired power plant capturing CO2? Sure there are. But a lot of the demonstration work that went on does show that things can be done on time, on budget, and that even today that facility continues to produce 100% green or carbon-free power 24/7, which is a very, very unique value proposition in the electric power industry. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. These webinars will be archived on our CCME website at the University of Houston Energy Program. I would encourage you to look back at the 45Q presentation from a couple of weeks ago. A great presentation last week by John Hoffmeister around the global energy landscape. Join us next week for Thursday at 10:30. And again, everybody be safe, and we'll see you next week.